In this video, we're going to be looking at overhead costs. Overhead costs, as you know, cannot be traced to jobs. However, these costs still have to be included for each job, otherwise the company will not be able to make a profit and sell the products at a correct price. Since the overhead costs cannot be traced to jobs, companies estimate how much the overhead costs are, and they end up assigning these costs to jobs. In the next set of slides, we'll go through how companies estimate and assign overhead costs to each job. Before we go on to that, we need to first learn about the activity base. An activity base, also sometimes called an allocation base, is an activity such as direct labor or machine hours that cause overhead costs to occur in a company. Activity base is the item that drives the amount of overhead costs that a company has. Let's look at a few examples. Look at this picture, and you can see this is a manufacturing facility. In this example, looking at the picture, we can assume that this is a labor-intensive operation. So a lot of the overhead costs will tend to be labor-related, such as having adequate space, maintaining that space at a proper cooling or heating temperature, having break rooms and restrooms to accommodate all these people. So we can assume that the amount of time people work in this factory could be driving a lot of the overhead costs. So for this particular company, the company may pick labor hours or labor costs as their activity base to allocate or assign overhead costs to jobs. Let's look at another example. In this picture, what causes overhead costs to go up? It's a machine-intensive operation, so a lot of the overhead costs are machine-related. Things like maintenance costs, there'll be a lot of maintenance on these machines, plus depreciation. We have depreciation expenses relating to these machines. So in this example, it would make sense that the company would use their activity base as machine hours. A company always has to go and determine what their activity base is, and once they find one that fits their operations, that's the activity base they're always going to use. Once a company selects an activity base, company will go through a series of steps to assign overhead to jobs and to record overhead to jobs. This chart is from your textbook, but there is a 4-step process to recognize overhead costs. Step 1 occurs at the beginning of the period, or sometimes maybe even before the period begins. Step 2 and 3 occur during the period, and step 4 occurs at the end of the period. We'll go through each of these 4 steps. When you're looking at the activity base, again, remember this is what drives the overhead costs. Companies typically pick one of these items. So they could pick direct labor hours as the activity base, direct labor cost, machine hours, direct material cost, or something else. The activity base or the allocation base will always be stated in the questions that you're doing when you're looking at homework or assignments. When you're reading a question, read carefully and identify what is the activity base that will help you solve the rest of the question. Now let's go through those steps. The first step occurs before the year begins or at the beginning of the period. The company has to estimate a total overhead cost for the upcoming year. They also have to estimate a total amount of activity base that they will use for the year. Once they have those two amounts, they're going to calculate something called a predetermined overhead rate. Your formula for predetermined overhead rate is predetermined overhead rate equals total estimated overhead costs divided by total estimated activity base. If your activity base that's used is direct labor hours or machine hours, you're going to calculate this as a rate per hour. If your activity base is cost, so it's direct material cost or direct labor cost, it'll be calculated as a percentage. So be sure to multiply this calculation by 100 to get your percentage. That's step one. That occurs before the year begins or at the beginning of the period. Then during the period, to apply overhead to each job, the company is going to take your predetermined overhead rate that you calculated at the beginning of the year and multiply it by the actual activity base used on each job. Again, applied overhead to a job is calculated by taking the predetermined overhead rate that you calculated at the beginning of the period and then multiplying it by the actual activity base used for the job. We're going to go ahead and look at an example. This says, ABC company applies overhead using direct labor hours as its activity base. At the beginning of the year, the company estimates total direct labor hours of 20,000 and total overhead costs of 500,000 for the year. Then they've said job J7 uses 44 direct labor hours. So that's the data given. They want you to calculate the predetermined overhead rate for the year, and then they also want you to calculate the overhead applied to job J7. The first thing that you always need to do when you're reading a question is to identify your activity base. In this question, they've told you in the very first sentence that they will be using direct labor hours as the activity base. So we know what the direct labor hours are. We know that that's going to be determining how we calculate our predetermined overhead rate as well as the applied overhead. Now let's go ahead and do the calculations. For part A, we're going to use the predetermined overhead rate calculation. So predetermined overhead rate, sometimes I abbreviate that as POHR, is equal to estimated total overhead cost for the year divided by estimated total allocation base. We'll call it activity base because that's the term that's used in your textbook. Now that we've got the formula, let's put the numbers. They told us that the estimated total overhead cost for the year was 500,000, so that goes in the numerator. And then estimated total activity base, we know activity base is direct labor hours. That's going to be 20,000 hours, so that goes in the denominator. 20,000 hours. That gives us a predetermined overhead rate of $25 per direct labor hour. One thing that I want you to remember is this POHR, predetermined overhead rate calculation, only needs to be done once per year. Once you calculate it, you use the same predetermined overhead rate to allocate overhead to every job during the year. Now let's look at part 2. Part 2 says calculate overhead applied to job J7. It says job J7 used 44 direct labor hours, so let's go ahead and apply overhead to that job. You know that your formula says applied overhead is equal to the predetermined overhead rate, which is what we calculated here, multiplied by the actual activity base used by the job. So applied overhead is equal to $25 per hour, which is the predetermined overhead rate, multiplied by how many hours? How many hours did we actually take to work on job J7? It's at 44 direct labor hours. So we multiply that by 44, and that gives us $1,100 of overhead applied to job J7. Now we'll be able to calculate the total job cost of job J7. They didn't give us enough information, but you know that total job cost is going to be equal to the cost of direct materials, direct labor, plus overhead applied, which would be 1,100 for this particular job. So to summarize, to apply overhead to jobs, first, the company has to calculate a predetermined overhead rate. When they are calculating a predetermined overhead rate, they have to take their estimated total overhead cost divided by the estimated total of activity base. This calculation is only done once per period. They only have to do this one time. Sometimes I do abbreviate predetermined overhead rate as POHR. So if you see in my videos, POHR, that is your predetermined overhead rate. Once this is done, companies now are able to allocate overhead to jobs or apply overhead to jobs based on this formula here. Applied overhead is equal to predetermined overhead rate. Also remember, I abbreviate this as POHR, multiplied by the actual activity base used by the job. That's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at how these costs are recorded in a job costing system. Please let me know if you have any questions.